Pete Conrad can sleep through just about anything. That cat can honestly fall asleep at any point regardless of what's going on. But his namesake, Pete Conrad, the commander of Apollo 12, had a bit of a harder time falling asleep on the moon. In fact, most of the moonwalkers found it very difficult to get solid shut-eye in the lunar modules. NASA knew right off the bat that astronauts would be sleeping on the moon. The shortest duration landed mission was Apollo 11, and the crew was on the moon for a little under a day, just about 22 hours, which meant that there would be a rest period during the lunar stay. And of course, looking forward, NASA knew that the longer missions, the J missions, would be extended stays on the moon for multiple days, meaning multiple rest periods. And so it had to address the issue of astronauts sleeping in the lunar module from the get-go. But it was a little bit easier said than done. For most of us, when we think about getting good night's sleep, we probably imagine a big, comfy bed with nice warm blankets and ideally a soft kitten curled up right next to your face. But that wasn't exactly the luxury that the astronauts had on board the lunar module. The lunar module was built expressly as a single-use vehicle to land astronauts on the moon. It had no application beyond landing on the moon with the Apollo architecture. Of course, it was used as a lifeboat for Apollo 13, but that's a separate story. Of all the considerations that led to the lunar module's eventual shape, weight was one of the primary concerns. In the name of keeping the lunar module's weight as low as possible, there were bundles of wires that weren't behind panels because the panels added weight. As we know, there were no seats. The astronauts flew it standing up so that they could see out the smaller windows because having less glass saved weight. And it was also tiny. It was designed to keep 2 men alive for about 2 days, with all of their gear and the rocks that they would eventually bring back from the surface. It wasn't a roomy vehicle. So all that being said, comfort was not exactly the primary design characteristic when it came to building and constructing the inside of the lunar module. On the very first mission, Armstrong and Aldrin were left to find a very comfy little bit of floor to sleep in when they had their one rest period on the moon. But to make matters worse, not only could neither man actually stretch out the length of the cabin, they also didn't take off their suits. NASA was concerned that the lunar regolith that they'd tracked in when they'd gone back inside after their EVA might get into their lungs. Both of them found it quite difficult to get comfortable. Armstrong ended up sleeping on top of the lunar module ascent stage cover, with one foot wedged under the disky and his head kind of raised up on a little bit of wall, while Aldrin was sort of fetal-like, curled up on a little bit of exposed floor. The cabin was also fairly loud. All the systems, the life support and environmental control, obviously had to be running through the night, so if a system turned online, all of a sudden it would be a new noise that would wake them up. Light was another issue. There were shades on the windows, but some light was able to get through. Not to mention the dials and the switches, many of them were lit up throughout the night. Neither man said they slept very well that one night on the moon, which is a little bit dicey when you consider that their next day's activity was rendezvousing with Collins in the command module. But as we know, they pulled it off brilliantly. Going forward from Apollo 11, NASA sent astronauts up with beta cloth hammocks. They had to be stacked one over the other in a crisscross section. It was the only way the two could fit, and even still, for some of the taller astronauts, it wasn't the best fit. They had a foot hanging over the edge or their head kind of hitting the top of the hammock. Light remained an issue for all the astronauts on later flights in terms of seeping through the window, as did the ambient noise of the water system turning on and the various environmental control systems running through the night. But with every mission, NASA learned ways to help the astronauts get more rest on the moon. On later missions, astronauts were allowed to take off their pressure suits while they slept, which made them a lot more comfortable. Sometimes they kept the liquid-cooled garment on, and sometimes they put on a lighter flight suit. Earplugs were found to be a pretty good defense against the cabin noise, and also sleeping pills. NASA knew the astronauts had to be rested no matter what it took if they were going to get a good day's work out of them on the moon. Another challenge when it came to sleeping on the moon: adrenaline. Many of the astronauts said they had a bit of a hard time sleeping on the moon because they were so excited about being there. If you want more details, like who was up all night and who had to take a sleeping pill on the moon, I've gone through mission by mission in my companion blog post over on Discover. The link is in the description below, so definitely check that out if you want to know a little bit more about how sleeping was on the moon. I also want to remind you guys that I have a new feature on Vintage Space, and that is sponsorships. I am now able to take sponsors. Any of you guys who follow me on social media know that I have about 7 jobs, so if you help sponsor Vintage Space, you're making sure that this channel will never fall by the wayside as I get increasingly busy. I've got more information on how it works with Patreon, and the perks that you guys get when you become sponsors of Vintage Space up in this video right up here. As always, you guys, what do you want to see in future episodes? Leave me your thoughts, comments, concerns, I guess, and anything else that's on your mind in the comment section below. Of course, be sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram for daily Vintage Space content, and with new videos going up every single week, including some fun live builds and unboxing things that I've got coming up, definitely subscribe so you never miss an episode. Have you ever wondered why, in the 1960s, NASA used splashdown landings and the Soviet Union landed on land? Yeah, I was curious about that one too. Okay, to answer this question, we have to look at other things beyond just the landing method itself. We actually have to start with why the launch sites for the two countries are where they are. When the US Air Force and eventually NASA started launching things into orbit from Cape Canaveral, it wasn't just an arbitrary choice. There were a lot of reasons that this as a launch site made a lot of sense. Engineers already knew, they'd known for decades, that the best way to take advantage of the Earth's rotation to put something into orbit was to launch closer to the equator. Cape Canaveral is probably the southernmost point in the United States that actually makes sense to launch, because it's not just the latitude that matters, it's the area around that launch site that's really important. Being coastal and having the Atlantic Ocean east of the launch site meant that anything going into orbit could take advantage of the Earth's rotation and also launch over unpopulated areas, aka the ocean. The Atlantic Ocean, engineers realized, was also a really great landing pad. Not only are there no people there to hit and potentially injure, it's much softer and more yielding than the land. Engineers realized that with a parachute, the ocean was soft enough to land on without risking bodily harm to the astronauts. It was also unpopulated, so if any winds came and moved the spacecraft over during that last phase of landing, they wouldn't risk hitting a person or a house or some building. Being away from all populated areas was the best bet. Also, the parachute method was the simplest. It was easiest when you're dealing with all the new unknowns of spaceflight with the Mercury program to just use a parachute and land in a safe spot. Then there's also the fact that the United States has a massive navy. Landing in the Atlantic Ocean meant that a navy ship or a fleet of ships could reach the astronauts within a few hours of landing. Even if they didn't hit their primary or secondary zone, if they hit a contingency zone, there could always be a ship in international waters less than 2 days from the crew. If you want to know why that 2 days is important, I've got a video about it right up here. The Soviet Union was in a bit of a different situation when it started looking at launching men into space. Russia is very far north, and there isn't a very good southern launch site that would take advantage of the Earth's rotation the same way Cape Canaveral does for getting spacecraft and payloads into orbit. That's why the Soviet launch site was not in Russia, it's in Kazakhstan. The Kazakh government leased the site to the Soviet Union in the 1950s. It's the southernmost point that was within the Soviet Union's empire, but it's still pretty far north. It's on about the same latitude as Portland, Maine. The site is also landlocked. There isn't exactly a nice cushion of yielding, soft, welcoming ocean around the launch area in case crews had to abort during launch or to land near where they took off from. The bodies of water that the Soviet Union did have access to are all in the Arctic Circle, meaning that they could be very dangerous for cosmonauts if they splashed down and then had to egress from the spacecraft while waiting for recovery crews. What the Soviet Union did have a lot of that the United States lacked is land. Lots and lots of areas with no people in it that would be a safe spot for a landing. It was simpler for Soviet engineers to figure out how to bring their cosmonauts down on land than it was to figure out navigating international waters or Arctic seas in a splashdown scenario. As we know, this required a much more complicated landing system. See, the cosmonauts in the early Vostok days didn't actually land inside their spacecraft. The parachute was still not going to slow the capsule enough to spare the cosmonaut from a really hard landing. So he had to eject before landing and land by a personal parachute, while the spacecraft also used its own parachute. It wasn't until the Soyuz days that the Soviet engineers perfected the system that is still in use with Soyuz today. The retro rockets fire at the last second before landing, slowing the spacecraft so it's a nice, smooth landing in an open field. Although, anecdotally, I have heard from a number of astronauts that it's still a pretty hard landing. But you know what? I'd take that hard landing if it meant I got to go to space. This wasn't a question that only I had. A lot of you guys have asked me about this as well, and as such, I've got a little bit more information in the companion blog post over on Discover. The link is in the description, so definitely check that out if you would like to know a little bit more about landings in the 1960s. And of course, if you have other questions or other things you'd like to see covered in future episodes, leave those in the comment section as well. I also want to remind you guys that I can now take sponsors on Vintage Space. I've got a video about how that works right up here. You guys can help me make the Vintage Space content that you love so much. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode of Vintage Space, and of course, for space every single day, follow me across social media on Facebook, Twitter, and on Instagram. And I'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much for watching. All the way at the top of the Apollo-Saturn stack, on top of even the launch escape tower, is a tiny little silver ball, which I neglected to paint silver on this model. But this little silver ball played a huge role in Apollo launches. This is what the Apollo command and service modules looked like before they launched on a mission to the moon, or to low Earth orbit if it was Apollo 7 or Apollo 9. The cylindrical service module held all the consumables for the mission, and the command module is this gumdrop-shaped module up top that was the only piece of the spacecraft to actually come back through the atmosphere at the end of a mission. On top of that was the launch escape tower, or the launch escape system. The launch escape system is this lattice-like structure and the 4 solid rocket motors that would fire to pull the spacecraft away from an exploding rocket if anything went wrong in the initial phases of launch. The 4 solid rocket motors actually had more power than the Redstone rockets that launched the first 2 Mercury suborbital flights. In the event of a launch anomaly, these 4 rocket motors would fire and pull the spacecraft free of an exploding rocket and land the astronauts safely in the ocean, or if need be, although it wasn't ideal, they could land on land. But pulling the spacecraft free of an exploding rocket during a launch abort wasn't enough. There had to be some way of knowing exactly where the spacecraft was going and what angle it was flying. And that is where the little silver ball at the top of the launch escape tower comes in. That little silver ball is bored with 8 holes, and they feed information to the cue ball. The cue ball is similar to a pitot tube on an airplane. A pitot tube measures airspeed in flight and feeds that information into the flight computer where the pilot can see it. The cue ball does something similar. It doesn't measure air speed, but it does measure air pressure, and that's actually where it gets its name. Pressure is sometimes referred to as Q, so air pressure ball, cue ball. It's not just reference to it looking like a bald man's head. But the cue ball didn't gather data just for data's sake, it gathered data for a very important reason. For one, it could actually help the rocket stay on course. Because the cue ball measured air pressure coming from all sides, it could tell if the rocket was off its nominal trajectory by as little as 1/8 of an inch. It could actually tell the engines all the way down at the bottom of the first stage to gimbal to correct for that off nominal trajectory. But there was an even more important role that cue ball played, and that was in a launch abort. In the event of a launch abort, the cue ball's measurement of air pressure on all sides would help determine which way the spacecraft and the launch escape tower were flying, making sure that the crew landed safely away from the launch tower. So this tiny little, barely obvious silver ball at the very top of a Saturn Apollo stack played a huge role. But if you look at it before certain launches in video or in images, you might see it look a little bit bulbous. That's because it had to be covered right until the last minute, just like pitot tubes are covered right before an airplane leaves the ground. And with good reason. If those holes become blocked at all, the data can be faulty, and this can lead to big problems. Insects building nests in pitot tubes have brought down full jets, so the risk of something clogging those holes and having a real problem developed was significant. The cue ball cover was 2 halves of a sphere held together by a 2-inch rubber band with a razor blade positioned behind the band, pinched between the halves of the cover. A wire rope was connected to the top and bottom of that razor blade and to both halves of the cover, and that rope was then routed through a pulley on the crane at the top of the launch umbilical tower and directed down a tube on the side of the structure. It was connected to a weight, housed inside that tube that in turn rested on a lever controlled by a pneumatic valve. The valve was actuated from the launch control center, rotating downwards and allowing the weight to drop down the tube, pulling the wire that cut the elastic that separated the halves of the cue ball cover to expose the cue ball to the air. This might sound like a super intense, over-engineered solution to the problem of covering the cue ball before launch. After all, airplanes just take off the cover manually before a flight. But this couldn't happen with the Saturn launch to the moon. Because the cue ball played such an important, life-saving role in a launch abort, it had to be kept covered until the very last second. It wouldn't do to manually uncover it before launch. There's still a chance for something to block one of those holes. The cover was only removed in the final 5 seconds before liftoff, and it had to be done remotely, and it had to be sure that it would separate. That's why the solution to the cover and separating it was so intense. The cue ball, as well as the entire launch escape structure, as well as the boost protective cover over the command module, were jettisoned around the 2-minute mark into the flight. Once it was clear that there was no need for the launch abort system, it was thrown away, and the crew went off on their way to the moon. A lot of you guys have asked me about the cue ball, so I hope this answers your questions. And this is the kind of question that I love, so let me know what kinds of things you would like to see me dig into in future episodes down in the comment section below. And because I can already hear you guys asking, yes, this is a Pete t-shirt. I have limited edition Pete t-shirts now, and I'm super excited. I've got the links you need to buy one yourself in the description box down below, so definitely check that out. You guys love Pete, you guys have asked for it, so I gave you Pete merch. Pete merch will be available for a limited time, so definitely check that out sooner rather than later. As always, leave any other questions, comments, anything in the comment section below. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram for daily vintage space content, and with new episodes every single week, be sure to subscribe right here so you never miss a video. Apollo was absolutely amazing. The inspiration of those videos of astronauts walking on the moon, the stunning close-ups of the moon and the pictures of our Earth from space, it was incredible. Personally, it's propelled my entire career. The legacy of Apollo, on the other hand, is crippling. I kinda think Apollo maybe sorta ruined spaceflight. Alright, I know tons of you guys are waiting to rage leave your comments already, even though I haven't started going into the details of this video. So I would like to remind you guys that I am not just some person on the internet. I actually do hold a bachelor's degree with combined honors in history of science and technology and a master's degree in science and technology studies, and I've written 2 books about the history of spaceflight. If you still want to leave your ragey comment before you hear what I have to say, go ahead. I'm gonna take a sip of water from my Apollo 11 glass. Alright, now that people have rage quit the video before it even started, we can dig in. Let's start at the very beginning, and I don't mean Kennedy before Congress in May of 1961. I mean Press Secretary for the White House, John C. Haggerty, speaking to the country on television on July 29, 1955. On that day, he appeared before the nation and said, "On behalf of the President, I am now announcing that the President has approved plans by this country for going ahead with the launching of small unmanned Earth-circling satellites as part of the United States participation in the International Geophysical Year." For the average person in the mid-1950s, rockets and satellites and space travel was the stuff of science fiction. But for a handful of scientists who understood what could be gained from exploring Earth and space and the sun from outside our atmosphere, this was significant. The International Geophysical Year was an international program of cooperation between a host of nations that ran between July of 1957 and December of 1958, and satellites were the only way of studying geophysical phenomena and solar phenomena without atmospheric disturbance. This was significant for science. The news of America's intention to launch a satellite reached Soviet scientist Leonid Sedov at the 6th International Astronautical Congress in Copenhagen, Denmark, 4 days later, and he immediately held a press conference himself wherein he announced that the realization of the Soviet satellite project can be expected in the near future. So, in 1955, we have Cold War adversaries, the United States and the Soviet Union, both announcing their plans to launch satellites as part of the IGY. By announcing the American program first, Eisenhower, however unwittingly, fired the starter's pistol in the race to be first in space. Anti-communist sentiments being what they were in the mid-20th century, the average American saw Russia as a backwards nation of potato farmers, definitely not a threat. So imagine America's surprise when the Soviet Union was the first to launch the promised satellite, Sputnik, on October 4th of 1957. Fear and worry were among the dominant American reactions, but for Lyndon Baines Johnson, then Senate Majority Leader, the reaction was scheming. LBJ realized that if he could leverage space and become the politician associated with shaping America's reaction to Sputnik, he might be able to use it to launch himself to the presidency. In the months that followed Sputnik's launch, while Eisenhower maintained his position that America's satellite program has never been conducted as a race with other nations, it was LBJ who pushed the National Aeronautics and Space Act through Congress. When Eisenhower signed the NAS Act, he effectively created NASA, which opened its doors on October 1st of 1958. So here's the first time we have to stop, take a little bit of a break, and grab some coffee out of my giant lunar mug that shows you where all the landings were when there's hot liquid inside it. Everybody looks at NASA's inception date, October 1st, 1958, as the day that America started looking at anything in space, but that's not true. NASA was formed with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or the NACA, at its core. The NACA was formed in 1913, and in the 40-plus years between its inception and NASA's inception, it became the governing body, the leading body of all aeronautical research in the United States. Programs that the NACA worked on included the X-15, which gathered some of the first data on human factors and hypersonic flight in advance of the space age. So NASA didn't pop out of nowhere and suddenly have to do stuff in space. It actually had decades of research coming to bear on the problem of spaceflight that it now had to handle. If you'd like more on that story, you can check out my first book, Breaking the Chains of Gravity. The other thing we have to keep in mind here is that NASA was not created for the grand purpose of uniting all space goals in the country. It was created because politicians decided to make it. Okay, let's get back into the story. So NASA's official reason to be was to bring together all the space research such that America could be a leader in this new arena. The unofficial but real reason NASA was created was so that the Americans could get a guy up in space before the Soviets launched a communist. Figuring out how to get that guy into space was the Space Task Group, this group of engineers charged with figuring out how to put somebody into space. But while the STG was trying to figure out basic orbital spaceflight, there were other people at NASA that were starting to figure out what the agency would do after achieving that goal. Because no one thought the Soviet Union would be there first, even though, Sputnik kind of surprised everybody. NASA's thinking was, we'll get a person up and then we'll start laying the foundation for a long-term spaceflight program. Eventually, sometime after 1970, we'll go to the moon. That lunar program was very sketchy at the time, but it was already starting to take shape. Engineers had already figured out that a blunt body was probably going to be the easiest for spaceflight, at least in the near future, so figured that that would be the lunar vehicle as well. It also knew that it would need a very specific guidance and navigation program. It would need a very advanced engine that could fire and refire in space. It would also need the life support and basic power capabilities to keep a crew of 3 people alive for 2 weeks. 2 weeks because that's the time it takes to go to the moon, and 3 people because then you don't have a deadlock decision. Wrapped up in this early planning was the idea that that mission would go straight to the moon as one giant rocket, land upright, at which point it would be ready to launch off the moon's surface and come back. That's a mission mode called direct ascent. Just go straight to the moon, land, fly straight back home again. However, that came with the challenge of building a giant rocket called Nova. So an alternate position was Earth Orbit Rendezvous. Basically launch that same big upright spacecraft in pieces and then build it in Earth orbit. That could be done on smaller rockets, but of course then you have to figure out how to actually build something in space, which was not something NASA knew how to do at the time. But in 1959, this is so far ahead that it's all conceptual anyways, we don't need to make any firm decisions. Flash forward to April 12th, 1961, and lo and behold, the Soviets do it again. Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human not only to go into space, but to orbit the Earth. At the time, all NASA could do with the Redstone rocket and the Mercury capsule was a pop-gun suborbital shot. So NASA is starting to fall even further behind. Gagarin is just the latest in a long series of Soviet firsts. At a press conference later that afternoon, JFK admitted he was tired of being beaten by the Soviet Union and added, "The news will be worse before it is better, and it will be some time before we catch up." While the president was speaking to the press, House Speaker Sam Rayburn addressed the House of Representatives Committee on Science and Astronautics with a proposed amendment to the National Aeronautics and Space Act, the act that had created NASA. He suggested that they install now Vice President Lyndon Johnson as chairman of a new space council. The motion passed, and LBJ became the decider. He would be the one telling Kennedy what to do in space. Kennedy would be announcing everything, but LBJ would be the one meeting with NASA and passing his recommendations on to the president. This was great for Kennedy, because if it all went well, he could take credit. If it all failed, he could blame LBJ as the advisor. It wasn't long before JFK leaned on LBJ in his new capacity as head of the Space Council. After Gagarin's flight, just days later, Kennedy suffered another embarrassment with the failed invasion of the Bay of Pigs, and he needed to save face. So he looked to space as something that could maybe turn everything around for his presidency. On April 20th, the president sent the vice president a memo. "Do we have a chance of beating the Soviets by putting a laboratory in space, or by a trip to the moon, or by a rocket to land on the moon, or by a rocket to go to the moon and back with a man? Is there any other space program which promises dramatic results in which we could win?" 8 days and many meetings with NASA managers and presidential science advisors later, LBJ made his recommendation to JFK in another memo. As for a manned trip around the moon or a safe landing and return by a man on the moon, neither the US nor the USSR has such capabilities at this time, so far as we know. The Russians have had more experience with large boosters and with flights of dogs and men, hence they might be conceded a time advantage in circumnavigating of the moon and also a manned trip to the moon. However, with a strong effort, the United States could conceivably be first in those two accomplishments by 1966 or 1967. Kennedy famously took Johnson's advice and asked Congress to fund a manned lunar landing mission on May 25th of 1961. If we are to win the battle that is now going on around the world between freedom and tyranny, the dramatic achievements in space which occurred in recent weeks should have made clear to us all the impact of the adventure on the minds of men everywhere.
I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
Kennedy knew full well that he would probably not be in office by the time the moon landing happened, but it didn't matter. He did something beautiful. Man, moon, decade. 3 terms that everyone can understand. The moon is right there, we can see it. We all have a sense of what a decade is, and we all know what a human is. Congress, as we know, agreed, and Apollo was off to the races. We often take May 25th of 1961 as the day Apollo started, but it really wasn't. NASA didn't make the recommendation, and LBJ didn't pass on the recommendation out of nothing. NASA knew that it was feasible to get to the moon within the decade, so it obviously had some preliminary background knowledge. Remember all that NACA stuff that it brought to bear when NASA was created? It wasn't like this was just the start date and everything started here. So when we eventually say it happened very fast in 9 years, it did, but it wasn't starting from absolutely nothing. We had a bit of an idea of what we were getting into before NASA started really laying the foundation for the Apollo program. When Kennedy put NASA on the path to the moon, he didn't exactly hand the agency a user manual. In fact, NASA literally had to write all the user manuals as the program developed. There was so much that NASA had to figure out, and the first one that it had been playing around with but hadn't made a decision on was how, otherwise known as the mission mode decision. We already looked at direct descent and Earth orbit rendezvous, but both of those required different spacecraft, so until NASA actually settled on a mode, it couldn't contract out building the spacecraft because the contractor had to know what it was building. To complicate matters, in late 1961, a new mission mode was presented, lunar orbit rendezvous. Lunar orbit rendezvous basically simplified the mission by lightening the spacecraft at the top of the stack, the bit that would actually land on the moon, by not having it all land on the moon. Lunar Orbit Rendezvous took advantage of the weight saving that would come from leaving the heaviest element of the spacecraft, the command service module, aka the gas tank, in lunar orbit while landing with a specific little landing bug. That bug could be two-staged, such that the upper stage could use the descent stage as a launch pad, therefore taking out the complication of landing a rocket upright and having the crew somehow ready it for a launch on the moon. NASA announced that it would go with Lunar Orbit Rendezvous on July 11, 1962, but it didn't fully commit to it until October of that year. That's over a year and a half figuring out the mode. After the mode decision was made in late 1962, could NASA really start digging into actually building all of the pieces of the spacecraft? But there was something else that came up in 1962, the Gemini program. NASA realized that it had a lot to learn about living and working in space, not to mention there was going to be a lull between Mercury and Apollo, so it created the interim program Gemini that would figure out all the technical things of Apollo, just in a different spacecraft. As NASA really started diving into the Apollo program, the sheer magnitude became visible. Every piece of the spacecraft was built by a different contractor. That goes for the spacecraft and the rocket, and they all had subcontractors. And you start to see how many places were involved in building Apollo. North American Aviation in Downey, California built the command service module and the second stage of the Saturn V, the S-2. Grumman in Bethpage, New York built the lunar module. Boeing in Seattle built the first stage of the Saturn V, the S-1C. Douglas Aircraft in California built the S-4B stage of the Saturn V. The rocket's development was done out of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, a center built in 1960 for this purpose. The Stennis Space Center in Mississippi was built to test the rocket stages. The Michoud facility in Louisiana was run by Marshall and was built to assemble the Saturn V. Also in the early days of Apollo, NASA moved mission control from Florida to Houston, Texas, in a political move. This was where all the human spaceflight activities would center. Very quickly, Apollo gave birth to this massive spaceflight industrial complex that touched every corner of the country. All this was happening, and JFK didn't care about space. He didn't care about science. He didn't care about exploring what was beyond our planet. He didn't even care about exploring the moon. All he cared about was landing there first to beat the Soviet Union. He told NASA Administrator Jim Webb on November 21st of 1962 that the moon landing was important for political reasons, international political reasons, adding that it was a race whether they liked it or not. As Apollo's budget ballooned in 1963, JFK became increasingly concerned that Apollo would be little more than a boondoggle that would ruin his legacy, so he brought his concerns to Jim Webb. On September 18, 1963, he asked, "Do you think the manned landings on the moon is a good idea?" Webb said yes, but Kennedy just didn't feel like it was worth pursuing. He wanted to end Apollo before it ended his good standing as president. So before the 18th General Assembly of the United Nations on September 20th, 1963, Kennedy called for Apollo's cancellation and replacement by a joint US-Soviet mission to the moon that would foster peace and cooperation instead of competition. A little more than 2 months later, on November 22nd, 1963, JFK was shot and killed during a motorcade in Dallas, Texas. LBJ was sworn in as president that same day. We never talk about the fact that Kennedy tried to cancel Apollo, and I don't know why. That's so significant, that he called to cancel Apollo, that he started laying the foundation for a joint US-Soviet mission. Whether or not that would have happened, that he started putting that idea out into the public before his assassination is very important for understanding how Apollo became what it was. After JFK's assassination, the moon landing took on a very different role. It was no longer just a politically motivated scientific goal. Now it had an emotional element, and all of that fell on LBJ. LBJ couldn't have canceled Apollo if he wanted to. Not only had his name become synonymous with space after pushing the NAS Act through Congress and doing so much to stay in the headlines as the politician who had his finger on the pulse of America's reaction to this new and interesting and exciting realm, he couldn't let Kennedy's legacy die. He had to see it through. There was no way Apollo was not going to get funded all the way through. And now for NASA, it wasn't just fulfilling a goal, it was honoring the fallen president's legacy. And that is extremely powerful. Honestly, I would say that JFK's assassination played a significant role in Apollo's success. It's no stretch to say that the 1960s were an incredibly turbulent decade. LBJ inherited a very messy country from JFK. He worked really hard to free Americans from poverty and racial injustice by introducing programs like Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, and Job Corps, all designed to give Americans a helping hand rather than a handout. He pushed the Civil Rights Act through Congress that prohibited racial discrimination, but racism remained a prevalent problem nationwide. He also inherited Kennedy's commitment to stopping the spread of communism in Asia, and soon found America in a full-scale war against the Viet Cong in Vietnam. Against this backdrop of social unrest, NASA remained in its own little bubble, laser-focused on getting to the moon, and it looked like it was taking great strides and gonna make it. The Gemini program taught NASA so much about living and working in space, it solved a lot of problems ahead of Apollo, and it could do that because Johnson was making sure the space agency got the funding it needed. In 1966, NASA reached a peak of funding. That year, it got close to 4.4% of the national budget, but it looked like it was money well spent. As 1967 dawned, NASA was poised to start manned Apollo missions. It had plenty of time to get to the moon by the end of the decade. But then disaster struck again. On January 27, 1967, the Apollo 1 crew was killed in a fire during a pre-launch test, the Plugs Out test. It was thought to be routine, but this test ended in tragedy. In a somewhat surprising move, Johnson actually allowed NASA to head up its own accident investigation. And to be fair, NASA did take a very good, hard look at itself. The silver lining of the Apollo 1 fire was that it happened on the launch pad and not in space. This meant NASA and North American were able to take apart Apollo 1 and really understand what had happened to the spacecraft. The result of the exhaustive investigation was that NASA found as many problems with the physical hardware of the spacecraft as it did with the management that had allowed problems to crop up in the first place. The result was a much better, much safer Block 2 spacecraft, as well as a culture that put safety above everything else. The agency recovered amazingly quickly. In 1968, a year marked by civil rights rallies, feminist demonstrations, and anti-war protests, NASA launched the unmanned Apollos 4, 5, and 6 to prove the technology was ready to go. In October, 21 months after the Apollo 1 fire, Apollo 7 marked NASA's return to manned spaceflight with a simple orbital test of the Command Service Module. That was Apollo 7. In December, it launched Apollo 8 to the moon with another Command Service Module. The lunar module was falling badly behind schedule, but the mission nevertheless proved the mothership was up to the lunar journey. When 1969 dawned, NASA seemed charmed. In March, Apollo 9 tested the Command Service and lunar modules on a simulated landing mission in Earth orbit. In May, Apollo 10 ran through a full landing dress rehearsal, stopping just short of the lunar surface. Apollo 11 was slated for the first lunar landing attempt in July, with Apollo 12 on deck for November launch, a backup window within the decade. As we know, Apollo 11 fulfilled Kennedy's goal on July 20th, 1969. From our modern standpoint, we romanticize Apollo. It was an incredible program where NASA, its contractors and subcontractors, 400,000 people developed the technology to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth in just 9 short years. Not only that, but we did it 6 times with Apollos 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17. We forget that NASA had been thinking about a lunar landing for years before Kennedy made it the agency's main focus. We ignore that both NASA and Apollo were created to save face against the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and that the space agency had a war-level budget as a result. We imagine Apollo as this wondrous program that inspired a generation, but forget that amid the chaos of the 1960s, close to 60% of Americans opposed the excess spending on Apollo when there were more immediate issues to solve at home. Apollo could not have happened without the social and political milieu that allowed it to exist, and yet we talk about it without that context all the time. Instead of changing the way we think about spaceflight and how it should be in the post-Apollo world, we say, if we were able to go to the moon in 9 years, why aren't we back? Why aren't we on Mars? Why aren't we here or there? Apollo, in short, has given us such unrealistic expectations of what spaceflight could and should be, because the perfect storm that allowed the moon landing to happen in July of 1969 can never happen again. Since Apollo, we just haven't had the national urgency driving space exploration, nor have we had the massive budgets we need to facilitate these kinds of programs. Compare the agency's 1966 4.4% of the national budget with the 0.5% it gets now. And yet somehow NASA's identity is still wrapped up in Apollo. Its value, perceived mostly by the average person, has become so wrapped up in human spaceflight, but not just that, of flagship human missions. We have this notion that spaceflight matters when the human is central. Presidents are not immune to the influence of Apollo when it comes to laying out space policy, and many have sought to have their own Kennedy moment. On July 20th of 1989, George Bush Sr. announced the Space Exploration Initiative, a program that would see construction of the space station Freedom, a permanent base on the moon, and a manned mission to Mars by 2019. Again, urgency was missing. Congress balked at the $500 billion price tag, and the program was never implemented. In 2004, George W. Bush Jr. called for a manned return to the moon by 2020 to lay the foundation for a manned mission to Mars, and also directed NASA to finish the International Space Station and retire the Space Shuttle by 2010. This prompted NASA to launch the Constellation program, the Orion spacecraft, the Lunar Lander Altair, and the Ares 1 and Ares 5 launch vehicles. Urgency was still missing, and Constellation fell victim to another challenge in space, changing administrations. Barack Obama canceled Constellation in 2010, 2 years after taking office. But canceling a major program isn't always that simple. That spaceflight industrial complex that Apollo created is still in place today. Each of the NASA centers and the contractors tied to the agency rely on space contracts to create jobs and drive local economies. To protect their constituents, congressmen presented NASA with a compromise: cancel Constellation, but keep the big rocket and the jobs of everyone building it. We got the Space Launch System out of the deal, NASA's deep space-capable rocket without a firm goal that's sometimes called the Senate Launch System. This year, Donald Trump's administration has tried, again, to reignite a big program. Vice President Mike Pence made the statement, "At the direction of the President of the United States, it is the stated policy of this administration and of the United States of America to return American astronauts to the moon within the next 5 years. The next step would be a permanent lunar base that could facilitate a mission to Mars." The problem is there's still no urgency and no funding, and that time frame is completely unrealistic. Another problem with Apollo-inspired programs: they're long. Kennedy knew he likely wouldn't be in office when Apollo landed on the moon. Presidents now will start programs and try to get it done within their administration, but it's so unrealistic. What would have to happen for a big program on the scale of Apollo would be for a president to start something in office that somehow could survive multiple administrations, whether there are international contracts like with the International Space Station or with private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin. The reality is we're not embroiled in a Cold War. We do not need to prove our technological might against an adversary right now. There's nothing driving our need to do these big-scale crash programs like Apollo, nor are they necessarily what we should be focusing on. These crash programs are single purpose. Apollo couldn't really do much else aside from go to the moon. There were some considerations about actually using it to go to Venus and Mars with the Apollo Applications Program, but obviously that never happened. What would make so much sense would be to start laying a solid foundation for long-term human exploration. But maybe it doesn't even need to happen now. Maybe we need to understand more, to learn more with robotic spaceflight before we start sending humans to Mars, because there's still a lot of challenges. Space is hard. Everything takes a long time. And honestly, everything in space is trying to kill you. Why are we rushing? We don't need to keep the speed of Apollo. We don't need to keep looking at that model. What we should retain from Apollo is the excitement, is the inspiration, is the wonder of that program that will keep people excited about spaceflight and space exploration for generations to come. What we shouldn't do is try to replicate these fast programs for the sake of replicating these fast programs. Apollo was amazing. What made it happen and what made it amazing can never happen again. So instead of trying to recreate it, we should create something new and let Apollo stay in the past. All right, that is my super long op-ed and my own personal feelings about the legacy of Apollo. What do you guys think? Aside from telling me that I don't know what I'm talking about, because I know those comments are going to dominate this feed immediately. Let me know what you think we should be saving from Apollo, how we should remember it, what we should do, how we should take inspiration for that for the next generation, because that's what matters. We can't just keep going over it again. I know I do that as an historian, but when we're looking at planning long-term spaceflight in the future, we need to start changing the way we look at space. What do you guys think we should be doing next? Let me know all of your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, guys, I do have the full, much more eloquent written piece that goes along with this on my blog over at Discover. And it includes all of the sources for all of those things that I was reading, all of those memos. All of that's over on my blog. Be sure to check it out if you would like to go into a bit more detail. All right, guys, happy Apollo 11 landing-versary. I hope you're all doing something appropriately spacey tonight and, most nights, because who doesn't want to celebrate the insanity that was going to the moon? Because let's be honest, they went to the moon and that's crazy and awesome. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
All right, hello everyone. You might know me from my channel, which would be the case if you're watching this on my channel. I am Amy, Shira Title from Vintage Space. Cheers to you. I guess I'll let you introduce your own self now.
Hello, Amy! So glad to have you here. I am so glad to have you here. And yes, I'm Scott Manley, in case you hadn't know, and I didn't know. And I am not an astronaut, but I play one on the internet. We have Kerbal Space Program here, and you, with all your amazing history of space knowledge stuff, have some real interesting corners which you are going to challenge me with.
I think today we're going to challenge you to go to Mars as per Werner von Braun in the 1950s.
To Mars?
Yay!
So I show a 3-stage rocket here with a little mini 3rd stage, I guess. But basically this thing is insane, right? It's something like 5,000 tons with 50 engines and then 22 engines on the 2nd stage and then 5 engines in the 3rd stage. This is what I've got. And it uses, because cryogenic liquid oxygen was the fuel of the future, no, they're all about nitric acid and hydrazine, so basically an environmental nightmare and pretty much toxic to anyone nearby.
Yep.
And it has wings on it as well.
Yes, because you need to reuse that glider so that you can launch it multiple times to build your space station before you go to Mars. So it has to land.
They also plan to reuse the 1st stage as well.
Yes, they did. So can you do that?
I've got to fill up on very important fuel here. This is Golden State of Mind from Ale Industries. It is a beer made during a hop shortage, and so they use tea instead.
I found this because it looked pretty today. Fluctuate whiskey inspired by craft beer. It's also quite delicious. I've also had a decent amount of it, so.
And you're not going to be doing the flying, so you can really get toasted.
I don't have to be sober. I just have to tell you what to do.
Yes. Well, I'm going to start with that 1st stage, or that final stage, not the 1st stage.
Yeah.
Because, well, how hard could it be? Actually, I should just forget about this 2nd stage and go and see if I can make this thing fly, because therein lies danger.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
We are going to have this thing probably falling out of the sky. So first of all, we need to switch to symmetry mode, and we get 2 of them.
It's got 2 wings towards the top and 2 much larger wings towards the bottom of the stage. Like the wings insert almost level with the engines, which looking at a drawing of it right now feels like a scary spot to have wings.
And hope for the least number of explosions, or at least the most entertaining kind of explosions. How does the tailplane set up on these? Is it like a tail here, or do we have tailplanes on each wing?
There are little, like, I don't know what the right word for it is. Like little like uppy. Okay, here's how I'm not an engineer. Especially, can we preface this by saying it's 9:30 at night and I've been up since 6 and words are not my strong suit. So if your wing is like this, it's got little uppy bits like this
Okay, so
on top of the wing.
Mini tails.
They're like mini tails. They're about halfway down only on the big wings though, the bottom wings, halfway down, and they're like 3/4, and they extend about 1/4 beyond the wing.
Does that,
if that
look
makes
convincing?
Sense. That does actually. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to do that, and then what we also need now, I think about it, is
I think they're only looking at pictures. I think they're only on the upper, what I imagine is the upper portion of the wing. relative to the
right.
pilot's canopy. This is great too because I've never successfully built anything with wings in Kerbal, so I've never. I didn't even know you could do this. This is awesome.
It is actually way harder to build things with wings than it is to build rockets. See, rockets can kind of fly just through their sheer power, whereas anything with wings requires an understanding of aerodynamics. You know, you can make a brick fly with enough rocket power, right?
Right. Yeah.
But making something fly with wings, you have to kind of think about what you're doing. Oh, look at that. Truly Von Braun.
I mean, I know you're a professional effectively at this, but like, I'm amazed. You're not doing that. You're not making, that's not good.
That's not.
That's
so
not
what's
good.
happening here is the center of lift is in front of the center of mass, and that makes it aerodynamically unstable.
Oof.
And
it's a.
yeah.
Oh.
Well, we didn't kill anyone.
Oh, yay.
Yeah,
I get really attached to them. That's bleak.
So all I'm doing is I'm moving these wings backwards. So the reason is that there's too much weight. Wait a second. There's too much weight back here and too much lift. So I can just grab these wings and slide them back, and that should make the thing a little more stable.
And now we maybe know why Von Braun's wings are awkwardly directly next to the engines.
Well, I was reading, and apparently the design that we kind of know about is, in part, designed by a cartoon artist from Disney, because his designs were a little more practical. And the Disney designer wanted to make it look a little more, you know, what's the word?
Like crowd-pleasing?
Crowd-pleasing, yes.
There's more artistry involved than just straight-up engineering.
Okay, no, it is still not liking that.
That's not awesome.
You know what? Oh
my god. Oh.
Wow.
How are they not dead? Good on you guys. Cheers, boys.
Science. I'm going to actually see if this is stable after I burned all the fuel. But I'm also going to shift these wings back a little further. It's these big ones. Maybe if I scale these wings down a little. Not quite that much.
The big ones? Okay.
No, the ones at the front. They're a little...
So...
I think...
I'm gonna learn. They are quite small in the drawing. So are they too big that they're generating too much lift for the thrust that's at the rear?
Right. So the center of mass, if we bring this up, center of mass is like right there.
Right.
And the center of lift is in front of it. So that is our problem.
Oh. Sorry, I'm leaning away from the mic so I can see in the screen.
Yeah. You know, in aviation and spacecraft design and everything, it's quite common that they have to put like ballast in things to keep it stable. Yeah, look at this. I have to move that way forward. Okay, I'm going to take these and just move them back.
We could double up and like fill it with water as ballast and then release it into the ionosphere with like Project High Water because science, right?
Yeah, we could. Uh-huh.
This is a happy place.
This is a happy place. Let's go to the happy place.
Oh, that's less of a happy place.
It's still a bit unstable. And that really is a bad sign.
Okay, can I ask a question that's maybe a dumb question, but I'll preface this by saying I am not the engineer here. Is it going to make a difference that we're only going to be flying this thing in the upper atmosphere?
Well, we eventually have to land
I guess
it.
we do have to land
Here's
it.
the thing, right? Notice how I have burned fuel and it is now a lot more stable.
Yeah.
So
except that it's sideways.
Land this thing
How is it flying sideways?
No, just because I'm turning so I can try and aim for the runway.
Oh.
You know? So I've now got it back under control because I have... oh, wait a second. Where's the gear? There we go. We're going to try and land it on the runway here. See this?
Oh my god.
So the beautiful thing is that because I've burned the fuel, I moved the center of mass.
Right.
And by moving the center of mass, it became stable again. So it's unstable. Okay, now
oh my god, it's really fast. Ooh.
Okay, I kind of did it a little hard. Still.
A little hard, he says, as there's just fire issuing from the space plane. But
you know,
it survived, and our Kerbin
It was
survived.
a dead stick landing.
That was, I mean, for a dead stick landing, like, good on you.
Yeah, and I stopped on the runway in plenty of time.
Yep.
And the crew is fine. I need a number from you.
Yeah.
How many engines in the second stage?
The second stage, so we're counting so that's, yeah, okay.
It's the middle stage of the moon rocket.
22 main propulsion rocket motors.
Okay, what's the layout? Are they laid out in rings?
They look to be, let me see if I can find a better image. They look to be honeycomb-esque.
Honeycomb-esque. Okay,
yeah.
so they're like laid out.
It looks like they're sort of lines, like they're rows. So they're like
Okay.
here, and then they're sort of like, they're spaced so that it's like, they're here, and then they're kind of offset from the other ones, and then they're back, so it forms a honeycomb.
Okay, how's this looking in terms of proportions? Let's zoom out a bit. Could use a bigger, this stage could be bigger down here, I think. Let's just try and
Yeah,
fit
I mean,
22 engines on this thing.
I think if we then go from there and just continue the line of that onto the first stage, it'll look good. It'll look like a Frankensteinian monster, but it'll look good.
Wow, is Frankensteinian an adjective?
It is.
That's
It is
cool.
now.
There, that's 22
Lots.
engines. And there it is. It can manage
Wow.
1G, which is enough. That looks pretty cool,
That actually looks amazing.
Okay,
there is-
now we need to get that first stage.
Okay.
I'm getting excited! I have no idea if I have enough Delta V, that's the only thing.
Should we talk about retro rockets?
You mean for landing this thing?
Yeah, for deorbit. I didn't think about that.
I'll use the rockets on this for deorbiting.
are we
We'll
gonna
just turn the
use-
thing around for now.
Yeah, okay.
Ooh, I like blue.
Oh, that looks awesome.
Well, let's keep it with blue for now. Let's just make it blue.
Is that, how many engines is that?
So that's 3 groups of 8, so 24.
You math.
Holy-
You math 51.
I do math.
There's so many engines.
This is so many engines. Again, we're not sure this will get off the ground, so I'm going to save it, and I'm actually going to put this on like a launch structure to hold it still.
Yeah, that's...
Because it will probably crush these poor engines under the weight of the fuel.
Yeah.
The Von Braun proposal was over 5,000 tons.
That is...
That was just to get to orbit.
5,000 tons. What was the Saturn V's weight?
3,000.
3,000, okay.
So
I
this
love
is
that you know that off the top
almost
of your head.
twice as... Yeah.
Do we need to think about, and I don't know if the system actually had it off the top of my head, but hold down arms to let it build up
No.
thrust, or are we just gonna like,
Yeah, I think we're just
for
going to
lack
go...
of a real word?
Yeah, we're not going to go with the thing, but we will have to add wings. Let's see if this works.
Ooh.
No, not quite as expected.
Oh, it's just on fire. Are the two first and second, are they all, what is happening? I can't even tell. The window's like tiny on my screen. Like, what is happening right now?
It is falling
trying.
over very
It is
slowly.
trying. Oh.
And they're still alive.
Oh.
Yeah. The whole rocket exploded, and then they were showered with a storm of rocket nozzles.
Sorry, that's really, really funny. I love the idea that your rocket explodes. It's mostly intact, but all of your rocket nozzles just kind of like pepper the area.
Let's be clear, they would have been covered in nitric acid and hydrazine in reality.
They'd be dead.
You know, I believe the Russians called this kind of combination the devil's venom.
Awesome.
Yeah. Okay, let's try this. I've shrunk it down, put it on a diet. Maybe it will get airborne. Change these
So
engines.
I found a couple of versions of this that looks like they have wings on that bottom stage. Would that help, or would that just make it worse?
Oh, we absolutely need wings on this bottom stage, and I suspect we need a big pair of wings here,
Yep.
and maybe smaller pair of wings here.
The images I'm seeing have 2 large wings at the bottom. Just the 2. Oh, wait, hang on. No, 4.
Okay.
4. Weird angles. Yeah, fins.
We have fins.
Fins.
Finish?
Basically fins, but like they're massive fins.
Like that size of fins?
I gotta go to Skype. Maybe not quite that massive. They're not dwarfing, in these images, they are not dwarfing the upper fin, the upper wings.
Okay, so...
A little bit bigger than the big wings on the upper stage. How's that for vague direction?
That is suitably vague, and I will endeavor to take your design specifications and turn it into a flying vehicle.
Ah, yay.
There you go.
I think those are too small.
How do those look? I'm gonna say that looks pretty cool regardless.
It looks pretty cool. It looks way too big, but
it looks way too big?
Yeah.
Oh, but I like the look of those. Just fins.
Yes. As I learned,
and it's never just fins.
As I learned, I think it was Jim Lovell who mentioned at a Apollo 13 event that fins were Von Braun's trademark, so can't not have fins.
Well, Von Braun was working in an era when he needed them, right? And the Saturn V had them because they weren't sure, but in the end the flight computer was capable of handling it. And so the next generation of Saturn V wouldn't have the fins, but of course they never
There was
got
no
that
next
far.
generation.
There was no, but they had it designed. Oh, it's still not right. Come on.
I don't
There's
even
just
know.
too
Like
much
it's
mass
just
in
there's
this
just so
first
much
stage.
fire like going up the rocket right now.
Really, I did the math on Von Braun's engines, and they're actually a lot more powerful than I expected. So he might have been very optimistic with his math on this. Also, he was pretty optimistic with his timetable, but whatever.
That's so many engines.
Yes.
Oh my god, I'm just like, I love the line down the side of the screen of just like, yep.
Yep, that's all those engines. Oh, and we're losing control.
Why?
You see, we need bigger wings here. You were telling me those wings were too small.
Told you the wings had to be bigger.
No, I believe that if you look to the recording...
Not the big ones. I mean, try it with the big ones. Maybe I'm wrong.
The big ones will be awesome. But I will definitely, I'll make these bigger, right? And you know what, I think
the other two, sorry, I didn't notice it, they should all 4 be big.
Oh, okay, so we'll make them all big. So let's
I don't know if that's going to make enough of a difference to losing control or not.
You know what will make a difference is just making them bigger.
Okay.
Longer and bigger at the root. Just increasing the control surface area.
Right.
It can only lead to good things.
This is a monster. Oh my god.
I mean, the Soviets built the NK-33 for their N-1 rocket, which was the best thrust-to-mass ratio of any rocket.
It was insane.
Until the Merlin. But it also had amazing specific impulse.
But there's interesting history, and I don't know, I need to go through this and like make a map of how it worked, and maybe you know offhand, because you never forget anything you hear or read, that like different design bureaus, right? Like it's not the same as the way NASA has centers that all work together that do different things. Like there are different design bureaus with different chiefs at the heads doing different things. And the thing with the N1 rocket was that they wanted, I can't remember, it transferred to so many people, but at some point it ended up under Korolev. But I think it was Korolev then that wanted bigger engines for it, but the guy running the bureau that had the technology to build bigger engines said, I can build you your engines, but I don't want to work on the M1 rocket. I want to build this rocket. And I think he wanted to do nuclear propulsion with these rockets. And Korolev, was it Glushko? I can't remember the names off the top of my head. I'd need to double check my notes on that. But and then Korolev was like, I'm not using something that's that scary. I want to use this fuel. And he's like, well, then I'm not building you a rocket engine, so you have to go with this guy. And this guy was like, well, we only have the, what was the engine called? Not the N1, that's the rocket. our
NK-33.
NK-33. So he's like, well, we have this. We can't make it any better. We don't know how to make it bigger and more powerful, but we can just shove a bunch more of them to give you the extra lift that you want. Because the N1 was not designed initially as a moon rocket. It was designed as a heavy lift to orbit vehicle. And then when it was suddenly repurposed for a moon rocket, that's when they had to add more engines to give it more thrust to actually launch something heavy enough to go to the moon off the planet in the first place. It's really interesting. The stories behind that, the way that structure, the structure of the Soviet program works so differently from NASA's is really, I need a map. I just need to map it one day. It's it's crazy when you look at the infighting. Like, you think the infighting of like US military is bad?
Right, I mean, the Navy versus the Army and von Braun and all
yeah,
that.
and the Air Force trying to eke out its little spot with its own rockets that are also derived basically from German engineering. It's just like, whew.
But it was, so Glushko was the guy that Korolev wanted to build the engines for the N1, but Glushko was basically saying, no, we can't do this using, liquid oxygen and RP and kerosene. He was absolutely not going to do it unless he could use hypergolics. Korolev did not want to put any person on a rocket which was using hypergolic fuel. Because, scary dissolving flesh kind of problems. Right, that's literally what happens. It's like
scary dissolving flesh kinds of problems. Yeah, pretty much. And then I forget what happened. I did this in my N1 blog post a few weeks ago, but yeah, when Korolev died and then the N1 was transferred to another design bureau and somebody had to take it over even though they didn't want it, and it was all kind of an interesting disaster in that way. Was it Mission? It was Mission or Mission? Yeah. Mission, yeah. But did he take over the one that predated OKB-1?
I mean,
that
he was
design
basically
bureau.
Korolev's next in line,
but
more or less.
But wasn't the N1 then transferred to a different design bureau, or was it that OKB-1 merged with Energia and then formed another design bureau that took that over as heritage technology, and then it just became sort of like the rocket that no one really knew what to do with or wanted to, because it ultimately ended up that it was, this is impressive, by the way, I've been yammering and not watching this, but you're doing good there.
I think my problem is my ascent is too vertical.
Oh.
And I'm scared to actually let this thing go, because as soon as I let it go, the aerodynamics are going to kick in and it's going to
How high are you not?
25 kilometers right now. I know it's still high enough that aerodynamics is going to be important.
There's no like thrust control system, reaction control system on that, is there?
There is no reaction control system. There's no, not reaction control, there is no thrust vectoring on these engines. Because according to the post I read, no thrust vectoring. So I'm just going to let this get down to about 30 degrees, and then I'm going to fire up the engine again. There we go. There. Now, and I'm telling it to hold attitude. Okay, and so now most of this control authority is actually coming from
the computer?
This cockpit.
Yeah.
Oh, dear. No.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's not good. I'm not happy.
You're not well, you have no right to be happy given how terribly I'm doing this. Okay. I'm going to try and get it back on course. I have Delta V to spare.
Right.
There we go. And let my apoaps get up to about 100 kilometers. And we totally did it. No, well, actually, we totally haven't done it yet. But we... wrong button. But we will get into orbit now because we have control and we have tons of Delta... We have enough Delta V to go to the moon because of Kerbalness. Yeah, so, I was going to remark, do you know about the British Interplanetary Society's moon landing design from the 1930s?
I know of it, but I have not read anything specific about it, so you can tell me details and I will not know much.
Well, it was just you were commenting about, things that people thought might make sense at the time and, of course, turned out to be bogus. And one of the things they had was their design included a heat shield for ascending through the atmosphere at great speed, but did not include a heat shield for returning.
Oh no! Really? Really?
I love that design. It's so insane on so many levels.
That's such an interesting thing to have it be
Like,
a heat shield. Was that by design, or was that just like...
Yeah, that was their design. Their design was like, well, we're going to be traveling through the atmosphere at great speed, therefore we need to protect the...
But did they not think that we will be traveling through the atmosphere at great speed, coming back down again?
I don't know. You know, these guys, they were not really... They were looking with the big picture.
Oh, we're spinning. This would be the worst re-entry right here.
This would be pretty close to the worst.
This would be like nausea central right now. I don't know.
I'm sure Joe Engel could handle it.
Yes, if anybody could handle it, it would hands down be Joe Engel.
Jude.
Could it get so hot that the friction somehow burns through and ignites the remaining fuel?
Yes, things can explode and catch fire and whatever. So.
Oh my god! It's stressing me out.
Well.
No.
Like, whoa!
Oh my god! Yeah.
I think I'm gonna be able to recover this if I don't.
If you recover this, I'll be pretty impressed.
Now I'm going only Mach 4. Oh my god! I'm much more survivable. I might have to land on the desert though.
I guess the goal. So are we going to say that success is living? Who do we have here? Jeb and Bill?
Jeb and Bill. I should have put Valentina in there because, you know, we need to represent everyone. But I forgot. Yeah. Do you know the story about, who's the guy that was in the X-15 on the test stand that exploded?
Scott Crossfield.
And the headline, you know, wet pants.
Yep.
Yes.
What was stories. They were just firing the engine and somehow like the engine exploded and it's like the cockpit shot forward and everybody thought he was going to be on fire and then they doused him. They doused him in water. Anyway. It was did that end up being the headline?
I think he was contacted by some news people, and it was
the only problem is my pants are wet.
Yeah.
Survives explosion, wets pants.
Yeah.
The time he taxied a plane through a wall. That's a really good story. It was like I think it was like the X2. Like it was like an insane multiple past Mach 1 flight, all kinds of crazy good piloting, and then he taxis and he's like, I've got this, and he goes right through a wall.
Yeah.
Then there's, his first ever flight when he landed with one barefoot in the X1. It's another really good one. Yeah. He, the windshield iced over and he had to, scratch out a little spot. I'm sorry, I'm very distracted watching this now. Oh my god, you're going really, really fast.
I have got
How are you going this? How fast are you
going? I'm only going 115 meters per second.
I don't...
Now I just need to flare it just right and then apply the brakes. So the problem is that the ground isn't perfectly flat. So this is like landing on a lake bed that's had waves on it.
Oh,
okay, we lost the wings. We lost the lower wings. But to be fair, you did tell me those wings weren't in the original design, so actually we've made it more faithful to Von Braun's design.
Ah, well played. That's awesome.
There, mostly success. I like how Jeb's really excited by this. Yes,
he's always so excited. That's why I kind of love Jeb.
This is going to be magnificent. Yes. Wow.
Oh, that was good. How far from home? Cheers. Cheers.
Cheers. Slancha.
That's amazing.
Jubilee. Oh, man. Look, we got him out as well. He's here.
Oh, don't fall. Don't fall, buddy.
Oh, he's going to totally jump.
Hey, buddy.
He fell.
Oh, he's so top heavy with that head.
Yes, they are.
What's up, dude? They're so cute.
A true hero.
I love these guys. I had a total blast shooting this video with Scott Manley. He's so much fun, and those of you who know him know that he is great at the nitty-gritty details of Kerbal Space Program. So if you do want to know more about the decisions he made in building his Von Braun ferry and all the little game things that he did, be sure to check out his video, and if you just want to see more Kerbal videos, definitely head over to his channel and see all the cool stuff he's put up there. And Scott and I are talking about maybe doing more of these collabs when we have time. What missions would you guys like to see us do in Kerbal with some commentary from Vintage Space? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and of course any questions or other random topics that you would like to see covered in future episodes on the channel. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram for daily Vintage Space content, and with new episodes going up every single week, subscribe right here so you don't miss anything fun. In 1963, the Aerojet Corporation presented to NASA a report detailing a rocket that was 400 feet long and was designed to launch out of the ocean vertically and could put a payload totaling 1.1 million pounds into low Earth orbit. Let's meet the unrealized Sea Dragon. Before we get into the details of Sea Dragon, let's put it into context against a few of its contemporaries, namely what the Soviet Union and the United States were launching at the time. Aerojet's report was published in 1963. At the time, the US was using the Atlas D version of the Atlas ballistic missile to launch Mercury missions into orbit. In the Soviet Union, variations of the R-7 rocket were launching the Voskhod missions into space. Both of these rockets stood about 100 feet and could put no more than about 3,000 pounds into low Earth orbit. Then comes along the Sea Dragon. Not only is it 4 times taller than either of these rockets, it can put so much more payload into low Earth orbit, 3,000 pounds versus 1.1 million pounds. And then there's the fact that Sea Dragon launches vertically out of the water as opposed to off a launch pad on the ground. And the final thing that makes Sea Dragon an incredible rocket of the early 1960s, it was designed to be almost entirely reusable, whereas Atlas and R-7 were both expendable. The Sea Dragon was a 2-stage rocket, and each stage only had 1 engine. This was an attempt to make it simpler. The simpler the rocket, the fewer fail points, and the more likely it is to work beautifully. There was an inner stage between the first and second stage, as well as one between the second stage and the payload stage. At the very top of the rocket would be an Apollo-style spacecraft, either an Apollo Command Service Module, or, if the mission was simple enough, a Mercury or Gemini-style spacecraft. The guidance and navigation and control for the entire mission would come from that spacecraft, the NASA Heritage one. That's because it already existed, so why not make use of what NASA was already developing? It was also a way to have the Sea Dragon potentially double as a manned launch vehicle, not just for unmanned cargo. The Sea Dragon was designed to be built using classic shipbuilding methods. After all, for Aerojet, if submarines could exist underwater for months at a time with complex electronics and even life support systems on board, why could the same methods not apply to a giant rocket? So the Sea Dragon would be constructed either at specially designed facilities for things that didn't yet exist, or in existing dry docks for the parts that were a little bit easier to build, like the fuselage. Then the rocket would be constructed in a specially dredged lagoon near Cape Canaveral. This would allow technicians to actually mate the rocket vertically instead of horizontally, like was done in the VAB for the Saturn V. It was a simple matter of keeping all exposed components above the waterline, rotating the rocket as need be to access certain components. The lagoon was also designed to give technicians calm waters in which to work, which meant that most of the pre-launch checkouts could be done in this lagoon with the rocket horizontal. It could also be fueled while floating at sea in these controlled waters. Once the rocket was completely mated, the portions were checked out, and everything was ready to go, it would be towed out to its launch location some 40 miles off the coast of Florida. At that point, the ballast unit would come into play to help upright the rocket. The ballast unit would be filled with fluid to kill its buoyancy, and by virtue of sinking, because it would weigh some million pounds on its own, it would move the rocket from its horizontal position into an upright position. This would be the point of highest stress on the rocket. Not only would it be dealing with mild waves, the force of moving it upright would put so much stress on the body of the rocket that it risked buckling. But the Sea Dragon's own construction was designed to counteract that. Both the first and second stages of the rockets used pressure-fed engines. That meant that the fuel and oxidizer tanks in both stages would be pressurized with a third gas to force the propellant and the oxidizer into the combustion chamber for a stronger reaction. It also meant that because the tanks were pressurized, they were more rigid. That meant that not only while the rocket was being towed and popped upright, the sheer structure of the rocket helped with its rigidity, but the internal pressurization helped keep it that much more rigid so that it could resist any kind of buckling from being uprighted. Once the final checks were done, the Cape would sign off on launch, and the actual launch sequence would be ordered by a tugboat standing nearby or floating nearby the launch location. The ballast unit surrounding the first stage engine would create a sort of casing. Now, of course, the engine was still exposed to water. It was going to start launching underwater regardless, but the ballast unit sort of protected it from heavy flows of either currents or waves or anything that might hit it and jostle the engine at the moment of ignition such that it would destroy the launch. 4 auxiliary engines on the second stage would fire just a fraction of a second before the main engine started. Then the rocket would fly smoothly out of the water, separating from the ballast unit, which would start to sink. And from there, the launch was fairly standard. After 81 seconds of flight, the rocket would be at an altitude of about 125,000 feet. At that stage, the first engine would cut out, and the second stage would ignite almost immediately, such that there was very little coasting. The second stage main engine, as well as those 4 auxiliary engines, would burn for an additional 260 seconds. Once the second stage main engine cut off at about 911,000 feet or 150 nautical miles, it all came down to those 4 auxiliary engines. They would fire for an additional 22.4 minutes. This was a low thrust period, but one sufficient enough to give the rocket payload just that little bit of extra velocity it needed to get into orbit. The final orbit would be about 300 nautical miles. The payload that would reach orbit was initially conceived as being a giant tank of liquid hydrogen, something that could refuel deep space missions before leaving the Earth. As for recovery, the ballast unit would sink initially, but inflatable flotation bags would bring it back up to the surface. Then it could be towed back to the assembly lagoon, where it could be mated to another rocket. The first and second stages were both recovered at first using just simple aerodynamic braking as they fell through the upper atmosphere, but the active stage of recovery would be using an aerodynamic deceleration device. This decelerator was a reliable and very easy system. It was a large conical flare, 300 feet in diameter, that could be pressurized with the same pressurizing gas as was used in the pressure-fed engines for each stage. This also ensured that both stages would hit the water at the correct nose-down orientation, a way that would minimize the forces and stresses on the body such that it could be refurbished easily and reused, as opposed to building a new one. After the first and second stages both splashed down, they would be recovered and towed back to the assembly lagoon. There they would be refurbished, and any parts that needed replacing could be replaced. But at the end of the day, most of the rocket could be just refurbished, mated together again in that lagoon, and used again on another Sea Dragon launch. As Aerojet noted in its 1963 report, the Sea Dragon definitely represented a massive leap in technology, but it wasn't one that was completely impossible. Every challenge with the Sea Dragon was actually just an engineering challenge, and engineering challenges could be solved. And it wasn't even that expensive. Aerojet predicted the cost would be about $2.8 billion over about 6 years to have the system operational. It all came down to the cost saved in reusing most of the rocket parts. But as we know, the Sea Dragon never flew. It was just not something NASA could work into its Apollo decade. Getting to the moon was just more important than building a 400-foot-long rocket that would just put fuel into orbit. But it's a pretty compelling idea, so it might be something that we could see pop up one of these days. That is the absolute Coles Notes version of the Sea Dragon. There is so much more to the story, including the intricacies of how it was built, the things like fuels it would use and pressurizing gases, and all the decisions that led to the aerodynamic decelerator. All of that is in my companion blog post over at Discover, so be sure to check that out if you want an even deeper dive into the Sea Dragon. But in the meantime, are there other early rocket concepts you've heard of that you'd like to see a video about? Because I love digging into these things for you guys. Let me know all of those things in the comment section below, and of course questions you might have about the Sea Dragon, other big rockets, or anything old-timey space. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and on Instagram for daily vintage space content, and if you guys want weekly videos detailing things you didn't even know you were curious about the early space age, definitely subscribe right here so you never miss an episode. As if landing on the moon for the first time in human history wasn't dramatic enough, Apollo 11 also experienced a series of 1202 program alarms and a 1201 program alarm. So here's what they mean. To talk about these program alarms, we have to dive into the Apollo guidance computer just a little bit. By the time the Apollo missions flew to the moon, the software program that ran the missions could fit, though only just fit, into a set of read-only magnetic cores. This meant that the pieces of information the computer needed to run a mission could be called up at any time. The computer could also run multiple programs simultaneously to get multiple data points at one time, which is really important. Let's take, for example, the moment of landing on the moon. The computer has to know where the lunar module is with reference to the lunar surface. It also has to know its attitude, its speed, as well as engine performance. These are all data points that the astronauts need to call up or input into the computer and read off the disk key. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the disk key and how the noun-verb situation worked on Apollo, I do have a video about that right here. So let's go back to the Apollo guidance computer and our example of landing on the moon. We know that we need all these different pieces of information flowing into the computer at one time, but the Apollo guidance computer was a single processor system, so how could it actually manage all of these things simultaneously? Well, it actually couldn't. It could process each one individually, but extremely quickly. Take that fast processing power and mix it with slow human reaction time, and you've got something that looks like it's running programs simultaneously, even though they're not actually exactly simultaneous. But still, there's a bit of a problem. We have all these different pieces of information that need to be processed, and we can't do them all at the same time. We have to put them in a priority order. So how do you know which one to take first, and where do they go when they queue up to be next in line? The Apollo guidance computer had a 12-word data area called the core set. This contained all the information to execute a given program. There were 6 of these core sets in the command module and 7 in the lunar module. In each 12-word core set, 5 words were taken up by processing information. The 7 remaining words were left for temporary variables or extra storage, whatever the need might be. So 5 words of memory in the core set to execute a program, and 7 words for all the variables and temporary information associated with that program. But it gets a little bit more complicated. Scheduling the next program fell to the executive. It looked at the task's starting address and its priority, and then passed that information to a no-back routine. This scanned the core sets to see where there was any available space for the program to execute, and if so, where that space was. So basically, it found an empty space in one of those core sets and put that program set to run in that space. Through exhaustive testing, teams at MIT's instrumentation lab that developed the software came up with a way such that no core set would ever be completely filled. There would always be a space for the next task. And of course, there was also the variable that if the task that needed to be done had a higher priority than one running, it could be interrupted to run the new program and then pick back up where they left off. So the program was never designed to be overloaded. There were enough core sets such that everything that would have to happen during a mission at any given time could be run nearly simultaneously, or else scheduled to run as soon as there was free space. So where do the program alarms from the Apollo 11 mission come in? Well, it seemed that the engineers at MIT thought they had developed a system that could not be overloaded. But on Apollo 11, the computer did get overloaded. In preparation for their lunar landing, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin turned on their rendezvous radar to track the command service module. This was a safety measure. It tracked the CSM so it knew where it was in case they needed to do an abort in the lunar module. The crew left the radar on in slew mode, meaning it had to be manually positioned by an astronaut, and this also meant that it wasn't sending data to the computer. But what neither the astronauts nor the guys in mission control knew was that radar coupling data units were flooding the Apollo guidance computer with counter-interrupt signals. This was due to an oversight in the computer's power supply design structure. These signals were taking up just a little bit of the computer's processing time, and the spurious job kept running in the background. So unbeknownst to anyone, this signal prevented vital programs associated with the landing from completing. So when a new task was sent to the computer, there was nowhere for it to go. The running and scheduled jobs were holding their core set and their vac areas. There was no clear space for a new job to be scheduled. When the executive found there was no place to put new programs, it triggered the 1201 alarm signaling executive overflow, no core sets, and also the 1202 alarm signaling executive overflow, no vac areas. This in turn triggered a software reboot. All the jobs were cancelled regardless of priority and started up again as per their table order, so quickly that no guidance or navigational data was lost, which is lucky. Apollo 11 had multiple of these alarms, 4 1202 alarms and 1 1201 alarm. Eventually, Buzz Aldrin realized there was a correlation between one of the programs he was trying to run and the 1202 alarms. Every time he tried to run the program that would call up range data to the landing area, he got that alarm. So he stopped running it and asked Houston for the data instead. Of course, engineers from MIT knew the 1201 and 1202 program alarms were innocuous, especially in the case of Apollo 11. And as we know, the alarms did not force an abort. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were able to land the Eagle on the Sea of Tranquility less than 10 minutes after that first 1202 program alarm. I've got a more detailed look at how the computer works with the core sets and the vac areas, as well as the story of Apollo 11 over on my companion blog at Discover, so I urge you guys to go check that out. The link is in the description, and hopefully it will answer any lingering questions you might have. I also want to remind you that I am able to take sponsors on Vintage Space now. This opens up some new interesting perks for you guys and also helps make Vintage Space possible. And those of you interested in the Pete Conrad Vintage Space t-shirt, I do have a link to my store down in the description. So a lot of you guys have asked me questions about the Apollo guidance computer, and I am not the expert. My friend Frank O'Brien is. He literally wrote the book on the Apollo guidance computer. I've got the link to that from Amazon in the description as well. If you want to know everything you never needed to know about how the computer worked, check it out. It is a brilliant resource and definitely something those of you with deep questions should have. So let me know if you have any other questions about the Apollo guidance computer or Apollo 11 or just anything you'd like to see covered in future episodes. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram for daily content, and of course with new episodes going up right here every single week, including some fun live streams, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Every single rocket that has ever launched anything into space, orbital mission, deep space, manned, unmanned, big, small, every one of those rockets has one thing in common: staging. Staging is a fundamental part of any mission launching, whether you're talking about a heavy lift vehicle like the Saturn V or the Falcon Heavy, or something much smaller like an Atlas. Staging is quite simply when one part of the rocket fires before another, so that the cumulative thrust on that payload is what gets it up into orbit. The reason rockets stage is because of weight, or more specifically mass, because a rocket would have to stage leaving another planet just like it does on Earth. Let's take my favorite rocket, the Saturn V, as an example. This was the only part of the payload that actually had to reach Earth orbit. The rest of the rocket, all this down here, was just designed to get that rocket up off the ground and into space. So when designing the launch vehicle, engineers had to take into consideration the mass of the payload that had to reach orbit. But that wasn't it. As soon as you start adding lower stages that have to provide the thrust to get that payload into orbit, that adds mass. And it's not only the mass of the structure of the rocket, it's also the mass of the propellant that has to fire to lift that mass off the ground. Do you see where this is compounding to make things a little bit difficult? It becomes a very interesting balancing act. Not only is the payload part of the mass, the rocket structure and the propellant also add mass. But as the rocket burns that propellant, the mass changes. It's that changing mass that opens the door for staging. So let's look back to our Saturn V. As the Saturn V is launching and everything's perfect and beautiful and lovely, all of the propellant in that first stage is being used and burned up. Well, once it's done, now the Saturn V is carrying that extra dead weight of the spent stage. There's no point in using more propellant to get more of the rocket off the ground if you don't need it. So what do? You ditch the spent stage. That's where staging comes in. Staging is really just a clever way to get rid of dead weight when you're doing something complicated, like putting a payload into space. Now, all that being said, there are different ways a rocket can go through staging. Let's start again with the Saturn V. That uses a kind of staging called serial staging. The stages are stacked one on top of the other. The first stage fires first, and then separates from the rest of the payload once its propellant is exhausted. Explosive bolts and retro rockets create clear separation between the spent stage and the active second stage, which then has room to fire. Now, the Saturn V in this specific case was a 3-stage rocket, but the exact same thing happens for a 2-stage rocket or a 4-stage rocket. It's just that sequence of staging all the way up the rocket's body. Another type of serial staging is called hot staging. It's what the Titan II that launched the Gemini program used. If you look closely at this rocket, you notice, like I was shocked to find the first time I really looked at a picture, that there are holes in the rocket's body. Well, it turns out that unlike the Saturn V, which gained distance between the rocket stages when one was finished before the other one fired, the Titan II fired while the stages were still connected. Those holes are vents for when the next stage fired to separate from the spent stage. There are rockets that marry serial and parallel staging. A great example is the Titan III. The main core stage of that rocket, called the sustainer stage, was a Titan II, and it had solid rocket boosters on either side. Those two boosters separated, parallel staging, before the main stage went through serial staging. Another kind of staging is parallel staging, and we're all familiar with that one because that's what the space shuttle used. The space shuttle's main tank fed the engines on the orbiter, but it needed a bit of an extra boost to get into orbit. Enter the solid rocket motors that flanked the side of the main tank. The boosters as well as the main engine fired to get the shuttle off the launch pad, and then once the SRBs had exhausted their fuel, they were detached and left to fall into the ocean. Now there's another kind of staging that's pretty rare but also familiar, though we may not realize it. This is stage and a half staging. And we know it because the Atlas D rocket that launched John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra, and Gordon Cooper into orbit on the Mercury program used stage and a half staging. With the Atlas D, the main engine acted as the sustainer. It was the only one that burned to get the payload into orbit. Around the sustainer engine was a sort of booster stage with two extra engines. Now these were side by side, so sort of parallel, but they also fell away vertically, sort of like serial. So basically all three engines would fire to get the rocket off the launch pad, and then once the first stage or half stage was done, it fell away and that sustainer stage continued on to put the payload into orbit. Of course, the dream, because it would be much simpler and potentially more efficient, would be a single stage to orbit rocket. That is exactly what it sounds like. One single stage would be enough to power a payload into space. That is not something that exists yet, although there are companies that are trying to bring that dream to reality. If you guys like this video, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode, and also I want to hear from you. Do you have other questions about rockets, about staging, about the Saturn V, the Titan, the Atlas? Let me know all of your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, don't forget you can follow me across social media for daily vintage space content on Facebook, Instagram, and on Twitter. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. The somewhat strange concept of establishing a space force in the United States has been in the news for months now. So let's talk about it. All right, let's start right away with the question of what exactly is Space Force? Well, Space Force is President Trump's proposed sixth branch of the military. For those of you who don't live in the United States, there are currently 5 military branches: the U.S. Army, the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Coast Guard, and the U.S. Marines. Now, why do we need this sixth branch? Why do we need a separate Space Force? Because any of you who know a lot about space history, or even just have a tangential knowledge of space history, know that military and space aren't exactly strange bedfellows. In fact, the link between military and space goes back right to the beginning of the space age. So let's dial it back and actually look at this history to understand where the military's relationship with space began and where it has evolved to now. In 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, we had the same 5 military branches in the United States, and 3 of them were developing missiles that could potentially be used to launch payload into space. But 2 of them were really close to readiness. The US Navy was developing small-sounding rockets for atmospheric research, and the Army, notably, had the German engineering team led by Wernher von Braun working under the Army Ballistic Missile Association. Both of these military branches presented themselves to President Eisenhower in the wake of Sputnik's launch, offering to launch a small satellite to match and then eventually surpass the Soviet achievement. President Eisenhower decided to go with the Navy's Vanguard rocket because it was made by Americans, and it was also one that was not built with military implications in mind. It was purely a research vehicle. That and, the Army Redstone rocket was built by former Nazis, which did have some PR implications. So we have 2 military branches offering to launch the first US satellites. As we know, The Navy's Vanguard was responsible for the infamous Flopnik launch on December 6th of 1957, and it was von Braun's team at the ABMA, the Army team, that eventually launched Explorer 1 into space, the first U.S. satellite, on February 1st, 1958, or January 31st, depending on what time zone you were in. So even though the early space age was dominated by the Navy and the Army, it was the US Air Force that argued it should have all control over space activities, and it sort of made sense. The Air Force was the one developing the space planes that would eventually become orbital vehicles, or at least that was the plan. In 1957-1958, the Air Force had the X-15 under development. It had been doing captive flights and glide flights. It wasn't yet doing powered flights, but it was a vehicle that had the capability of going into space, not orbital space, but flying above the Kármán line. The Air Force was also developing Dinosaur at the time, the skip glide vehicle that could be launched into space. Now, the Air Force was doing both of these programs in conjunction with the NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. The NACA, in a nutshell, was the organization that did all the aerodynamic work for all of the major aviation players, including the military. Basically, the NACA had access to the best mines, the best wind tunnels, all of the things you need to really start to develop a beautiful, streamlined plane that can do things like fly Mach 7, which the X-15 was designed to do, and Mach 20, which was the Dinosaur's design limit. President Eisenhower was thus faced with all of these military branches vying to be the controlling entity in space, but he didn't want it to be militarized because we can't forget that the space age started out of the Cold War. And for all of you kids out there who don't study the Cold War in school, the Cold War was a war of ideologies between the Soviet Union on one side and the United States on the other. It was a Cold War because it didn't erupt into an actual hot war of launching missiles across the ocean to kill each other, although it did generate conflicts, mainly the Korean War and the Vietnam War. So Eisenhower, unwilling to let this completely unknown entity of outer space, which had a handful of things orbiting around the Earth in it, become a new battleground in the Cold War, decided that it should be run, that all the space program in the United States should be run by a neutral entity. And so he created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. And while NASA has always been a civilian agency, that doesn't mean that the military hasn't had a hand in space. The Redstone that launched the early Mercury missions was built by the Army, the ABMA. The Atlas that launched the orbital Mercury missions came from the Air Force, as did the Titan II that launched the Gemini missions. That Titan II missile is a version of the one that was in missile silos, ready to be launched in the event the Cold War turned hot. Arguably, the Saturn family of rockets, the one that gave us the Saturn V that took us to the moon, started with the Army. Von Braun and his team were developing that series of rockets before the ABMA was transferred to NASA in 1960. And there's more military participation in space than that. In 1963, NASA and the Air Force decided to cancel the Dinosaur program because, well, it was kind of an aptly named dinosaur, and replace it with a militarized version of the Gemini spacecraft called the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. Going forward into the shuttle era, one of the reasons the shuttle was as big as it was because the Department of Defense offered to help fund the program if it had the capability to launch DoD satellites. There's no real reason the payload bay had to be that big. And speaking of big payload bays, the Hubble Space Telescope was made of a disused DoD satellite, which is why it fits so perfectly in that massive payload bay. Okay, so up until the mid-1970s, we've got relatively minimal military applications in space. We've got the military providing some of the early launch vehicles, and we've got the military trying to turn some of the NASA spacecraft into militarized programs. Just should say this right now, the MOL program had one unmanned launch and then it was canceled. All of that is relatively innocuous, but there is one less innocuous interlap of military and space, and that was Star Wars in 1983. And no, I am not talking about the theatrical release of Return of the Jedi. I am talking about President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. The story with Reagan and SDI starts in 1979 before he was president. He was visiting NORAD, and during that visit asked somebody there what would happen in the event of a nuclear strike from the Soviet Union. He was told there was nothing to do. there's nothing to do. You can't intercept the missile. You can only track it and hope by some miracle that you can evacuate the target location in time, but basically fatalities were inevitable. Well, Reagan didn't really like this answer, so he directed one of his advisors, Martin Anderson, to find a way to do something. Well, the only way to do something is to intercept it in space. Now, every ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, is slightly different. It depends on where it's launched from, where it's going, what kind of engine it has. There's tons of variables. But because they're traveling such a large distance and going at significant speeds, they will generally go into space. Now, space starts at about 50, 60 miles, depending on who you ask, above the Earth, but ICBMs can travel as high as 300 miles or even further. That is further out than the ISS. The International Space Station orbits at about 200 miles above the planet. So in 1981, Reagan becomes president, and his advisors continue working on this whole space-based missile intercepting system. And in 1983, he announces SDI to the world through a televised broadcast. And because it involves breaking up a missile in space, it was dubbed Star Wars by the media. And even though the name is kind of used to mock the idea, it is kind of fitting because the technology sounds like something right out of Star Wars. The system was basically a series of Earth and space-based laser battle stations named Excalibur that would aim laser beams at a Soviet missile to move its trajectory so that it wouldn't hit the United States. Ideally, you could move it right off a trajectory where it wouldn't impact the Earth, so no one would have to really deal with the nuclear strike. So while SDI might have sounded like a good idea during the Cold War era, it never got off the ground, quite literally. Even though the technology was proved to be conceptually sound, President Clinton, who took office in 1993, found the program to be ideologically unsound and canceled it. Historians are still debating the legacy of SDI, which is where it becomes pretty interesting. So there's an opinion out there that even if the Soviet Union wasn't fearful of SDI, it didn't want to spend the extra money developing the counter program, so it didn't force it into bankruptcy, which means that it didn't really have an impact on the Cold War. But there is another argument that supports SDI, saying that it brought a new era wherein policy wasn't for mutually assured destruction, which kind of kept the Cold War at bay for a long time, that then it became a policy for protection of the American people. There's also an opinion out there that Reagan had to move forward with it to maintain strategic advantage over the Soviet Union. So whether SDI looked like it was building up the arsenal of the United States or it brought about a détente, either way, it seems, historians agree, that it had some relatively significant impact on ending the Cold War. I personally don't have an opinion on this. I have not done nearly enough research into SDI to say definitively what I think, but it is super interesting. And it also kind of brings up an interesting point to discuss with the idea of Space Force, which is where this whole rant started. Since we're discussing Space Force, SDI becomes an interesting case study as an example of a military space program proposal that never did anything physically, but still had a significant impact in international relations. So we can only take this as a case study, right? We're in a different time. In the 1980s, we were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and America was hell-bent on destroying the spread of communism throughout the world. Now, our relationship with Russia is different, to say the least. Things are also very different technologically. Space technology has developed significantly since the 1980s. In 2007, China used a missile to destroy an old satellite in orbit, which proves that it's possible to use a missile to destroy significant satellites in the event of war. So, would it be useful to have a military branch that deals exclusively with space beyond the existing military branches that deal with pieces of the space puzzle? It's actually events like that 2007 Chinese destruction of a satellite with a missile that has had people in Washington discussing the potential use and benefit of a military branch dealing exclusively with space for a number of years now. And really, the idea behind Space Force isn't that far from SDI. The primary goal of Space Force would be to protect American space-based assets and attack enemy assets in the event of war. Think about it. We rely on GPS, as does the military. If you take away all of the military support systems that are communications, GPS, anything like that, it could seriously hamper an attack. I mean, this is a pretty poor analogy, but imagine D-Day happening, and everyone has their positions geolocated and is getting all of the updated information as the attack goes on through satellite-based communications, and suddenly that network is wiped out. That could be a seriously bad day for a military and for a country. Another goal of Space Force would be to track space junk, which is something that the US Air Force already does, because there is a lot of it and it can seriously impede military action. Again, pieces of old space junk hitting satellites could be very problematic. Needing to launch new satellites and having a debris cloud of junk could be a problem. Cleaning up that space junk could be an excellent peacetime task for a body like the US Air Force or Space Force, so that when it comes down to a time of war, all the satellite paths are clean. There's even talk down the line, very far down the line, of Space Force acting sort of like a coast guard for travelers going to the moon or tourism in space. If someone is stranded, Space Force could be there to do a rescue. A lot of the pushback of Space Force is coming from the Air Force, which is not entirely surprising. The Air Force does a lot of activities in space and stands to lose a lot if that is all passed off to a new military branch. But the Navy and Army are also working in space and stand to lose a lot as well. So would it be really problematic to establish a new military branch? Not really. I mean, it's happened before. The US Air Force was part of the Army until 1947, and it was restructured. It would be messy and probably really expensive and complicated, but it's doable, so that's not really the stopping point. I think the main sticking point for me, whether or not it's something the country needs, I don't know. I am not in closed-door meetings with the military and political higher-ups, powers that be in Washington. The thing that stands out to me is that this would go against decades of treaties that have been signed and ratified over the years that say that space is not to be militarized. Now, there have been a number of these treaties, but the most notable of which is the Outer Space Treaty that was signed in 1967, and it was designed to set up a legacy of non-armament in space, ensuring that space remains a domain for peaceful exploration. Personally, I'm a fan of the idea of no military in space. Now, I know the Air Force will be tracking things. We all know the X-37B does its weird mystery stuff in orbit for a year and comes back, and it's all classified so no one knows what's going on. But I love the idea of space exploration being something that's done for humanity and for science, and yes, I'm aware that makes me super idealistic, but when we talk about missions to Mars and Venus, because let's stop ignoring Venus, I love Venus, I would love to see it as kind of the ISS approach of a multinational mission that takes space as something that can be an example of the best that humanity can do and has to offer, as opposed to potentially the worst that we have to say, which is war and destruction and killing each other. It's unlikely that my, peaceful, everyone holding hands, happy vision of space exploration is the future. But to me personally, the idea of space going forward, space exploration going forward, free of weapons, does seem like a step in the right direction. I have to give a special thanks to Audible for making this video possible, which means I have something awesome for you guys who love space, love books, but maybe don't have a ton of time to read and instead prefer to listen to books on your commute. To get your first audiobook free and start your 30-day free trial, go to audible.com/vintagespace. Or if you're in the US, you can text Vintage Space to 500-500. If you're keen to learn a little bit more about the early space stuff I talked about in this video, my own book, Breaking the Chains of Gravity, is available in addition to an amazing array of titles from space and science to fiction and everything in between. So go to audible.com/vintagespace, or in the US, text Vintage Space to 500-500 to start your 30-day free trial and get your first audiobook entirely free. There are a lot of opinions on Space Force, about the military in space, about whether or not this is a good idea. Of course, I want to hear them. Let me know all of your thoughts and comments down in the comment section below this video. If you guys want more Vintage Space, be sure to subscribe for bi-weekly videos and for content every single day. Be sure to follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and also on Facebook. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. This thing is